I've got a story to tell you. It comes from a little town nestled down deep in the middle of not much else. The kind of place where nothing seems to happen. And the kind of place where evil likes to hide. I call it the Voyeur. Anybody that moves needs time to adjust to the change. But Kevin hated his new town. He left behind his friends and everything he'd ever known. And now he lives in a nowhere town with absolutely nothing to do. But beyond the normal complaints that come with change, one thing bothered Kevin more than anything else: the people. They would gawk and stare and talk behind your back. Some drivers would slow to a crawl so they could get a good look at Kevin. Most onlookers would try to be subtle, looking away when they realized Kevin had spotted them. But many were shameless with their interest. Kevin supposed that when you lived in a town as small as this, it was just the kind of attention you got when you were new. And when you lived in the murder house. Nothing happened in the house. But that didn't matter. When a woman beats her husband to death, then gouges out her own eye in the middle of the street, it shocks towns like these to their very core. Knowing this was the former home of a murderer didn't bother Kevin. He thought it was kind of cool at first. But then people started watching him as he walked home from school. Everywhere he went, people would stop and stare. As pervasive as it had become, Kevin started to get used to it. In time, he didn't even notice it anymore. But that all changed the day he saw the Shadow Man. The man seemed to be cloaked in an unnatural darkness and stayed just far enough away on Kevin's walk home that he couldn't get a good look at him. The Shadow Man seemed to melt into the background, but was around every corner. Kevin could never make him out. The Shadow Man had a cold stare that pierced through Kevin all the same. Kevin walked faster, but only ever caught a glimpse of the man before he disappeared when he looked back. He ran, but he couldn't outrun that unnerving sensation. When Kevin got home, his heart was pounding and his body was covered in sweat. He looked out every window to be sure the Shadow Man wasn't there, but he couldn't shake the unease. Kevin went to his room and locked the door. Many restless hours later, Kevin finally fell asleep. But it didn't take long for the Shadow Man to notice. He stepped confidently into Kevin's room and crept closer to Kevin, watching the rise and fall of his chest with each shallow breath, and taking pleasure in the darting of Kevin's eyes under his lids. The Shadow Man knelt and pushed his featureless face closer to Kevin's. Goosebumps exploded all over the Shadow Man's flesh as Kevin's breath blew over him. The Shadow Man reached out with his long, ashen fingers and gently pet the boy's face. In a burst of speed, the Shadow Man snapped back his arm like a snake, rearing back to strike, and thrust his fingers deep into the boy's left eye. Kevin threw his body up and away, grasping at his eye to feel everything intact. A dream? But the phantom pain that still lingered from his dream had felt too real. His heart raced, and he looked for the man who had never been there. Gasping for air and nearly in a panic, Kevin heard a distant whisper. "I see you." He darted to his window and tossed back the curtain, only to see nothing. Behind him, a crash as something fell off his dresser, and the sound of something quickly moving behind it. He lunged at the sound, but nothing was there when he arrived. "I see you." The voice was closer this time. He stood and turned to the voice. The room was empty, but the walls started to spin and the floor undulate. His stomach lurched with the disorienting motion, and he staggered forward, barely able to stay on his feet. "I see you," the voice called from above. Kevin twisted his head to look up and immediately lost the last remaining balance he had and crumpled to the floor. As he lay there, a psychic probe pierced Kevin's mind. He couldn't move. A pressure grew inside his head. A voice, small but growing, began to rattle around in his skull. Foreign hatreds invaded his thoughts. The familiar feeling of being watched had returned, and the Shadow Man's presence was unmistakable. But as Kevin's vision came to him, it wasn't the silhouette of a man that began to resolve. An eyeball attached to a network of nerves stayed close to Kevin's face. Each nerve a tendril that moved with a horrible grace. They twisted and bundled amongst themselves to form a musculature that pinned Kevin to the ground, with the eye perfectly centered in Kevin's vision. Every glance into its terrifying iris was a scorpion strike to the brain, leaving behind a venom that infected and mutated all of Kevin's thoughts and feelings. Memories were changed, fears were amplified, hate was implanted, and Kevin's control was wrenched away. The eye pushed itself closer to Kevin, stabbing his mind with its murderous desires. "I see you!" Kevin could not look away, but he no longer wanted to. His body had relaxed, but his mind was on fire with an impregnated rage he could no longer recognize was not his own. Kevin lay still as the nerves forced themselves into the crevice between his left eye and its socket. They wormed their way deeper and pierced the internal flesh, making their way to Kevin's brain and spine. The eye started to back its way into Kevin's socket. The pressure was gentle at first, then crushing. Kevin's eye popped, and the wet gore oozed out from behind the lids. Kevin didn't scream. In fact, he didn't make a sound. The room was silent. Kevin blinked and then stood up, his face caked with horror. His parents would be asleep upstairs, and that wouldn't be a bad way to get started. Later, as he came downstairs, he turned off all the lights. He opened the front door, peered out into the darkness, and made his way out into the night.